Law enforcement is often portrayed as a world of duty, honor, and bravery, but sometimes it descends into unimaginable horror. Across the globe, there have been incidents where officers met their end, not just in the line of duty, but in ways so disturbing they still haunt public memory. These cases go beyond routine risks, exposing the raw brutality that can erupt in high-stakes confrontations. From calculated ambushes to tragic betrayals, this list delves into 5 of the most horrifying police deaths ever recorded, grim reminders of the ultimate price some pay while upholding the law in an often unforgiving world. On the night of July 7, 2016, what began as a peaceful protest in downtown Dallas quickly turned into one of the deadliest attacks on American law enforcement in recent memory. The protest itself had been organized in response to the recent police shootings of 2 black men, Alton Sterling in Louisiana and Philando Castile in Minnesota. Across the U.S., tensions were high. Communities were grieving, angry, and demanding justice. But in Dallas that evening, the atmosphere was calm. People marched through the streets, voices raised not in chaos but in hope, calling for change. But then, everything shattered. As the protest was wrapping up and people were starting to head home, Micah Xavier Johnson, a 25-year-old Army Reserve veteran, emerged from the crowd. Armed with a rifle and wearing tactical gear, Johnson began firing on police officers with alarming precision. In the chaos that followed, 5 officers were killed and 9 others were injured, along with 2 civilians. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Sirens blaring, people running for cover, officers scrambling to locate the shooter. Johnson wasn't acting randomly. According to reports, he had specifically targeted white police officers. His actions were fueled by anger over the treatment of black Americans by police, and he made it clear, both in his actions and in later negotiations with the police, that this was retaliation. But this wasn't just rage. It was calculated. Johnson had received military training, and it showed. He moved tactically, took cover, and even ambushed officers by firing from behind pillars and walls. At one point, he cornered and fatally shot an officer at close range. The situation turned into a tense standoff inside El Centro College, where Johnson had holed up. For hours, police tried to negotiate with him, attempting to bring the situation to a peaceful end. But Johnson refused to surrender, continuing to fire and threatening to do more harm. After exhausting all other options, the Dallas Police Department made a decision that would make history. They sent in a robot armed with explosives to neutralize him. This marked the first time in U.S. history that law enforcement used a robot to kill a suspect. The explosion killed Johnson and ended the standoff, but the damage had already been done. The city and the nation was left reeling. 5 officers gone, many others wounded, and a community left trying to make sense of the violence. President Obama called it a vicious, calculated, and despicable attack, and cities around the country increased police presence at public events, unsure of what might come next. In the aftermath, people struggled to reconcile the tragedy. The protest had been peaceful. The message had been justice, fairness, accountability. Johnson's actions had twisted that message into something else entirely, something dark and violent. His attack didn't bring people together. It deepened divides. The Black Lives Matter movement, which had nothing to do with the attack, was unfairly blamed in some circles, and the conversation about police reform got even more complicated. Looking back, the 2016 Dallas police ambush wasn't just a horrific event, it was a turning point. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about race, violence, and justice in America. It showed us how quickly a peaceful demand for change could be overshadowed by a single act of hate. And while Dallas has continued to heal, that night remains a painful reminder of how fragile progress can be, and how important it is to protect the spaces where people come together, not tear them apart. On the morning of July 17, 2016, the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was still reeling from the recent police shooting of Alton Sterling, a 37-year-old black man whose death had sparked national outrage. Protests and public frustration were high, and tension between police and the community was palpable. Then, in a devastating turn of events, that tension exploded into tragedy. Shortly before 9 a.m., a man dressed in black and armed with a semi-automatic rifle and multiple other weapons began moving through a commercial area near a gas station and car wash. The man was Gavin Eugene Long, a 29-year-old former U.S. Marine from Kansas City, Missouri. Long wasn't just passing through, he had come to Baton Rouge with a mission, one that would end in violence and death. A 911 call had been made about a suspicious person in the area. Officers responded, unaware that it was a deliberate trap. Long ambushed them, using tactical movements and cover to his advantage. Within minutes, 6 law enforcement officers were shot. 3 were killed: Montrell Jackson, Matthew Gerald, and Brad Garafola, and 3 others were injured, 1 critically. Witnesses described the scene as chaotic and terrifying, with rapid gunfire echoing through the area and people running for safety. Police rushed to contain the situation. A gun battle broke out as officers attempted to neutralize the threat. Eventually, a SWAT officer shot and killed Long, ending the deadly encounter. But the damage had already been done. Baton Rouge had just experienced one of the most violent attacks on law enforcement in recent U.S. history. Investigations soon revealed that Long had carefully planned the ambush. He had driven to Baton Rouge days earlier, rented a car, and scouted the area. He recorded videos expressing his views angry, militant, and filled with anti-government and anti-police rhetoric. He saw himself as a vigilante, calling for violent action in response to police brutality. Though he claimed to act alone, he cited groups like the Sovereign Citizens Movement and seemed to embrace an ideology centered around black nationalism and armed resistance. The ambush came just 10 days after a similar attack in Dallas, where 5 officers were killed during a protest. The Baton Rouge shooting further inflamed an already fragile national mood. It wasn't just another act of violence. It was part of a disturbing pattern, where lone gunmen were taking matters into their own hands in the most destructive way possible. The aftermath of the attack left Baton Rouge shaken. The community mourned not just the officers who died, but the deepening divide between police and the people they serve. Officer Montrell Jackson, one of the victims, had actually written a heartfelt Facebook post days before his death, expressing the pain of being both black and a police officer during such a turbulent time. His words resonated across the country. "I'm tired, physically and emotionally. I swear to God I love this city, but I wonder if this city loves me." Long's actions were condemned across the board by activists, political leaders, and citizens alike. They did not represent a movement or a cause. They represented a breaking point in a single individual, whose path to violence did nothing to bring about justice or change. Instead, it deepened wounds and made it harder for communities and police to rebuild trust. The 2016 Baton Rouge police ambush stands as a sobering reminder of the consequences of escalating rhetoric, unchecked anger, and violence masked as justice. It was a day that changed lives, claimed heroes, and left a scar on a city that was already hurting. Imagine you're at a coffee shop on a quiet Sunday morning in late November 2009. Just trying to wake up and mentally prepare for work. That's exactly what 4 Lakewood police officers were doing at a Forza coffee shop in Parkland, Washington. They weren't in hot pursuit of bad guys or cracking big cases. They were simply grabbing some caffeine and catching a breather before their shift. But what started as an ordinary morning turned into one of the most shocking and heartbreaking events in Washington's law enforcement history. Those 4 officers, Sergeant Mark Renninger, and officers Ronald Owens, Tina Griswold, and Gregory Richards never got the chance to leave that coffee shop. A man named Morris Clemens walked in and opened fire in what can only be described as a cold, calculated ambush. The officers didn't even have time to react. But in a moment of incredible bravery, Officer Richards managed to draw his weapon and return fire, injuring Clemens before succumbing to his own injuries. That one shot would play a huge role in how the next couple of days unfolded. Now, who exactly was this Clemens guy? Oh, just your average walking red flag with a criminal record that stretched back to the 1980s. He had a long history of violent offenses in Arkansas and somehow kept slipping through the cracks. Most controversially, he had actually been granted clemency years earlier by then-Governor Mike Huckabee. Yep, that decision came back to haunt the political world big time. At the time of the shooting, Clemens was out on bail for multiple charges and had been acting erratically, making threats and talking nonsense about divine missions and law enforcement. After the shooting, all hell broke loose. Authorities launched a massive manhunt that involved hundreds of officers, roadblocks, helicopters, and tip lines that never stopped ringing. It was an all-out scramble to track this guy down. For nearly 2 days, Clemens managed to stay one step ahead of the cops, using safe houses, changing locations, and relying on a small group of friends and relatives who were foolish enough to help him hide. But eventually, the law caught up. On December 1st, a Seattle police officer spotted a suspicious vehicle parked on a quiet street. When Clemens showed up nearby, the officer recognized him, gave him a command to stop, and Clemens made one final, fatal move. The officer opened fire and took him down, ending one of the most intense manhunts the state had ever seen. The aftermath of the shooting was massive. The community was in shock. Thousands of people came out to mourn the officers, hold vigils and support their families. Donations poured in. Streets were lined with flags, and people who had never even met the victims felt like they had lost someone close. It was that kind of moment heartbreaking, unifying, unforgettable. At the same time, people started asking some very serious questions. How could someone with Clemens' history still be walking free? What does this say about our bail system, our parole system, and the policies that are supposed to keep dangerous individuals behind bars? The shooting sparked a storm of debates and reforms in law enforcement and the justice system that continue to echo today. So, yeah, what started as a quiet morning coffee run became a moment that changed lives, policies, and a community forever. A tragic reminder that sometimes, even in the most ordinary places, history shows up uninvited. On January 6, 2021, something happened in Washington, D.C. that shook the very foundations of American democracy. The United States Capitol, the iconic building where laws are made and the peaceful transfer of power is symbolized, became the scene of an unprecedented and alarming event. That day, thousands of supporters of then-President Donald Trump gathered for a rally near the National Mall, energized by weeks of claims that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen. Despite no credible evidence supporting these claims, the crowd was fired up by Trump's speech that morning, where he urged them to fight like hell to challenge the election results. As Congress was meeting inside to formally certify Joe Biden's victory, the rally quickly escalated. The crowd surged toward the Capitol building, breaching security barriers and overwhelming the police. What followed was chaos. Rioters broke windows, smashed doors, and stormed inside, forcing lawmakers to evacuate or hide in secure locations. It was a terrifying breach of a place that represents the core of American governance, carried out by people who believed they were defending their country, though their actions actually threatened the democratic process. The violence and destruction led to multiple injuries among law enforcement and rioters, and tragically several deaths were linked to the events that day. The images of rioters wandering the halls of Congress, waving flags, and sitting in the Speaker's office shocked the world. For many, it was hard to believe that something like this could happen in the United States. In the aftermath, the Capitol Riot became a national crisis. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies scrambled to respond, and the National Guard was deployed to restore order. The event sparked widespread condemnation from political leaders across the spectrum, and it led to the second impeachment of President Trump, who was charged with inciting the insurrection. Though he was later acquitted by the Senate, the damage to the country's political landscape was undeniable. Investigations into the riot uncovered how failures in security planning contributed to the breach, and how some individuals inside and outside government may have played roles in encouraging or enabling the attack. The House of Representatives formed a select committee to dig deeper into what happened and to recommend ways to prevent such an event from ever happening again. The Capitol Riot was more than just a violent protest. It was a direct attack on democracy itself. It exposed deep divisions in American society and showed how dangerous misinformation and distrust in institutions can become when mixed with political passion. As the country continues to heal and reflect on that day, the hope remains that lessons will be learned and safeguards will be strengthened to protect the peaceful transfer of power, the very heart of democratic rule. In early 1993, a small rural compound just outside Waco, Texas, became the center of one of the most intense and tragic standoffs in modern U.S. history. This was the Mount Carmel Center, home to the Branch Davidians, a religious group led by a man named David Koresh. What began as a federal raid over alleged firearms violations quickly escalated into a 51-day siege that would end in flames, controversy, and the deaths of 76 people, including many women and children. David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, was a charismatic and controversial figure who claimed to be the final prophet of the Branch Davidians, a splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He preached apocalyptic messages, amassed a loyal group of followers, and was believed to be stockpiling weapons inside the compound. There were also disturbing allegations of child abuse and polygamy, with Koresh reportedly taking multiple spiritual wives, some of them minors. Federal authorities took notice. On February 28, 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, launched a raid to serve a search warrant and arrest Koresh. But things didn't go as planned. The Davidians were tipped off, possibly by a local news crew asking for directions, and when agents approached, gunfire erupted. A fierce firefight left 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead. With the raid a disaster, the FBI quickly took over. What followed was a tense, drawn-out siege that lasted 51 days. The FBI used a mix of negotiation and psychological pressure tactics, including blaring loud music and harsh lights at night, cutting off power and supplies, and even using tanks to crush perimeter fences. Meanwhile, Koresh remained inside, refusing to surrender or release many of his followers. Negotiations led to the release of some children, but dozens of people, including Koresh, stayed inside. As the weeks dragged on, pressure mounted. On April 19, 1993, the FBI launched what it called a final effort to end the siege. Using tanks, they began pumping tear gas into the buildings to force the Davidians out. Hours later, fires broke out inside the compound. The flames spread rapidly, and within minutes the entire building was engulfed. 76 people died in the fire, including David Koresh. Only a handful of people made it out alive. The exact cause of the fire remains disputed. The government maintained that the Davidians set the fires themselves, while survivors and critics argued that the FBI's tactics triggered the blaze. The use of force, the siege strategy, and the tragic outcome sparked intense controversy and multiple investigations. The Waco siege left a deep scar on American law enforcement history and became a flashpoint for anti-government sentiment. It inspired books, documentaries, and public debate, and even played a role in radicalizing individuals like Timothy McVeigh, who cited Waco as a major reason behind the Oklahoma City bombing 2 years later. Today, Waco remains a powerful symbol of mistrust between some citizens and the federal government. The events of 1993 are a sobering reminder of what can happen when ideology, suspicion, and heavy-handed tactics collide in a high-stakes standoff.